Welcome to the show your parents, the PTA, and the asleep don't want you to hear, the Helios blog. Today, Russel Brand interviews Jordan Peterson. This should be interesting.
The reason she's alone is because she's difficult.
Women are not accepting the bare minimum.
Women fuck men they respect.
All the women who say things like, I'm strong, independent, I don't need no man, like, y'all impress me.
Women just gaslight each other and say what they want to hear.
Could and within this idea around identity politics and it being a kind of the ultimate celebration of the individual, that it has baked into it kind of is preventative of unity almost in the way that it defines itself. Could you also touch upon
Divide and Conquer, Julius Caesar?
This attack perhaps on nature's self, and within that masculinity. I know it's an idea you've talked about extensively, but in relation to identity politics in particular.
Okay, so interesting. It's very interesting, Russell. One of the things that Carl Jung intimated near the end of the Second World War was that the fundamental danger of Protestantism as such was the continual fragmentation of the religious enterprise. And you see this with the multiplication of Protestant sects.
Yep, that's right. It's, the more you divide people, the less likely they are to stand against you, right? And this womanist, wokist philosophy, all it does is it's inherently self-destructive, inherently self-fragmenting, inherently... It's great for the sake of divide and conquer.
Let's say.
Seems,
and
anyway.
He thought that the ultimate extension of that would be that each individual, in some sense, would become their own church. And so when God identifies himself to Moses in Exodus, he says, I am that I am, or I am what I am. He identifies himself as the principle of being and becoming itself. All right. Now, if you identify reality with your subjective experience only, you attribute to yourself that quality. I am the ultimate arbiter of what constitutes reality. But there's a weird twist in that, and it's one that
my truth, not the truth.
I don't exactly understand, because the subjectivity to which all things are to be subordinated tends to be allied with an extremely narrow hedonism. And so the people who are pushing forward an identity politics seem to identify their own individuality with nothing more, let's say, than their immediate sexual desire. And I would say sexual particularly because so much of identity politics is about sexual attraction.
Right.
And then you might say, well, it's a pretty strange theory of human existence that you are to be identified with one biological whim, let's say.
It's actually very funny because it's like there and back again, right? We're back to fertility religion, right? We're back to reproduction as the most important thing.
And
that should be worshipped.
And the unity that you're describing, I don't even think in some sense is metaphysical or transcendent. I think what it is the hammering into a higher order unity of the plethora of fundamental motivational and emotional systems that would otherwise manifest themselves as a pure local subjectivity. And if that happens, you run into the psychopath problem. Like if you're only out, let's say you identify yourself with your desires, your immediate desires. Well, then you're going to treat everyone around you and yourself like a means to the gratification of those immediate desires. And what that will do is that'll destroy you in the future because you're not giving your future self any allowance. You do terrible things now because they're pleasurable, regardless of consequences. And you treat everyone else as if they're lesser and subordinate to your whims. This higher unity, it isn't less real than the subordinate whims. It's more real. Like the hero archetype is the most real representation of the human self. It's the most real. And it's based on the idea of something approximating.
This is maybe the coolest realization that Jordan had, because he has lectures and he talks and, he comes to certain conclusions. So one of the coolest things I heard him say, and actually, it's why I think that people that think that fiction is useless are stupid. And it's because in many ways, fiction is more real than reality. It's hyper real. It distills reality into the archetypes. So actually, reading fiction helps you to understand reality better because it distills the key points of reality down. Okay, anyway.
Courageous self-sacrifice. So, for example, you see in the dragon fight story, the notion that you have to confront what you're terrified of and repelled by. You have to do that voluntarily. The more assiduously you pursue that, the bigger the treasure you garner. If you garner the treasure, you're obligated to distribute it generously to the community. And it's all of that that makes up that central archetype of the hero. And that is the central unity, right? That unites the individual internally, unites motivation and emotion, and then unites each individual with the community.
A sense that the hero cannot be mobilized or galvanized without that motivation, that the fuel doesn't arrive until the hero it transcends from egoic motivation to communal motivation.
Well, it's very funny because it sounds like Eastern philosophy, right? The principle of when the student is ready, the teacher will appear, but also that collectivist kind of thought. That when fueled by the ego, you cannot confront the dragon sufficiently. There's a few things that I want to pick up on, and this is this idea, if I may, sir, of utility. That when we see other only in terms of utility, it's obviously restrictive. But I would love to fold into this one of the things you taught us earlier in the conversation: the role of sex in our evolution, and indeed all of evolution, in order to introduce new complexity. If sex has such an epochal role in the evolution of our entire species, surely then it is connected to this consciousness that is ulterior to manifestation and materialization, and therefore its role. I'll bet it is. Although I never considered that idea, that like consciousness is directly tied to like sexual reproduction. It's an interesting idea to think about. Certainly it's been strengthened through natural selection, that's for sure.
Is almost archetypically significant. I also want to offer you this, if I may, regarding the Cain and Abel analysis. There has to be an ongoing tension between the assertion of our roles as individuals. We have to exist. I have to exist as Russel in the world. I have to know that it is Russel's mouth that I put food into, rather than the mouths of others on the most basic biological level, that I am indeed, that my entire reality is subjective. That is all I know of reality, and yet I am aware of my insignificance. Somewhere within us, there is some fractal interface between our relative insignificance and our total if not omnipotent, omniscience, that all reality takes place within my consciousness, yet materially I'm borderline irrelevant.
It's very interesting to think about. I've also not ever thought of that. We are to some degree omniscient in the sense that, well, no, omniscient isn't the right word. Omniscient is wrong. Because we don't know everything, but we are the lens through which we see our own reality. But that doesn't mean you understand or know everything in your reality. That would be ridiculous. I think he's just choosing. His word selection is wrong. But I wonder what the correct word is in that case. Again, maybe somebody in the comments can find the right word. What is the word for information being solely interpreted by you from your own perspective? Solipsism? No. Solipsism is not having trouble understanding other people's perspective because you believe only your perspective exists. But it isn't true that only our perspective exists. It's the idea of we filter the information of our reality through our perspective. I wonder if anybody in the comments knows the word for that. Because omniscience is not the right word. Omniscience is knowing everything, which is not what that is. Okay, anyway.
perhaps there is something of this Cain and Abel tension here. I believe that if people don't have a felt and personal subjective experience of God, whether that's through Christ or the Prophet Muhammad or Buddha or yogically, some sense of a self beyond self, or some sense of an entity beyond self, some felt experience of knowing that is not about what Russell wants and what Russell doesn't want, then we do become victim to this hedonic ideology.
He does really sound like a person who's taken mushrooms, doesn't he? Anyway, I digress.
That seems to assert itself in the absence of a more deliberate ideology. I've been thinking too of the distinction between bliss and ecstasy. Bliss perhaps offers us the idea of fulfillment. Our cup is full. Ecstasy offers us the idea that my cup runneth over, that boundaries are being burst. This seems to me relevant with your hedonic analysis. So I say that when we strip away God and the possibility of God, then that subjective experience becomes God. That becomes the higher principle around which we organize. So there does need to be some new way.
Yes, I do agree with that. I've actually come to that conclusion myself. That's why I call womanist workers' philosophy the new religion. There's a reason why I call it that, because that's how it operates in the world. It really operates like, you know, if you've heard of the Salem witch trials or whatever, you know, like, oh, you're not woke, you're not one of us, burn the witch, burn the infidel. How dare you speak out against my religion? How dare you tell me that my truth is less important than the truth? You know, that sort of thing.
Of introducing to politics sacredness, the sacrament, the idea, somehow the representation of this tension, that we are part of the divine, that we have rights, but we are not only our rights, we are also our duties. I know that's not a question, but I also know you'll have things to say.
Well, okay, so there is a gospel injunction as well to render unto Caesar what is Caesar's and unto God what is God's. And you mentioned a reintroduction of the sacred into the political. And what has happened, as you also intimated, is that the sacred has collapsed into
the sacred has collapsed, become a new religion, and that has gone directly into the political, right? You have that wokeist, womanist religion directly influencing politics. That's a real thing, 2024.
The political, and that means there are now sacred cows in the political, which is why we can't discuss politics with each other. You need to separate the sacred and the political has to be subordinate to the sacred. I mean, this is one of the most remarkable and powerful discoveries of mankind as a whole, is that the principle of political sovereignty has to be subordinate to the principle of sacred sovereignty. And the Christian idea, and this develops out of the Jewish tradition, is that the fundamental principle of sovereignty is, what would you say, is voluntary. It's voluntary. It's a voluntary sacrifice. That's what's at the center of the community, and that the highest is properly devoted to serving the lowest. That's an inversion of the let's say, the class.
I forgot what this is called. Noblesse oblige. Like the obligation of the noble is what Jordan is talking about.
Classical notion of power. Might makes right if I can crush you. And if might isn't the principle of sovereignty, you have to ask yourself, well, what is? And you could say, well, nothing, in which case you have a kind of nihilistic chaos, and then hedonism rules. And if there's something sovereign above power, then you have to ask yourself what that is. And that is exactly what the biblical corpus, by the way, is trying to sort out. So you see prophets, for example, emerging repetitively in the Old Testament, and they are people who, what would you say, they evince faith that the fundamental structure of reality is good, and that if you live in truth, you can bring about a new reality that's even better. That's the axiom of faith. Then they'll confront, let's say, the tyrant or the catastrophes of the natural world with that banner in hand and revitalize. And the biblical narrative is predicated on the idea that the Christian Savior is the ultimate expression of that developing spirit, right? The manifestation of that, the embodied manifestation of that.
I'm going to ask you now some questions that will be that have elicited and have been elicited from our audience. Excuse me. See Sound of Freedom. What does this mean? The success of this movie? Does it mean that you can now bypass the typical and former establishment models of promo? Does it mean that people are interested in stories that have a sort of a plain sort of Christian ethos? What do you think is the significance of this film and its success, Jordan?
Well, I was just in Hollywood 2 weeks ago and I met some stars there, and they were older and very well-established people trying to make their way forward appropriately to the best of their ability and doing that well, I would say. But I really got the sense, and it was from other things that happened in LA too, that time is over. And I know from talking to my friends in LA, and I can't be sure that this is 100% correct, but that the only star now, for example, who can ensure box office success is Tom Cruise. And interestingly, Cruise is also one of the stars who's completely...
It's very funny because he's a Scientologist.
Dissociated himself from the political. I mean, I know he's involved with Scientologists, and that's neither here nor there for the moment, although it might have given him somewhere to put his religious enterprise, and kept him out of the political. But then you see that also happening at the same time as the writer's strike. And my sense of the writer's strike is that no one cares. And I think that system has collapsed. Now, you look at what happened with The Sound of Freedom. Part of that is people saying, to hell with the woke entertainment mob.
Okay, what is The Sound of Freedom? Let's see. The Sound... I've never heard of it. Again, I see it looks... it shows me The Sound of Music, which I'm aware of, but what is this? After rescuing a boy from ruthless child traffickers, a federal agent learns the boy's sister is still captive and decides to embark on a dangerous mission. He quits his job and journeys into the Colombian jungle, putting his life on the line to free her from a fate worse than death. Okay. And it's a thriller from 2023. What is controversial about it? Film's portrayal of child trafficking. Okay. All right.
We'll go watch this just because we're being told not to. But part of it also is the desire for people.
I see.
The desire that people have for a truly archetypal story. And whatever else you might say about The Sound of Freedom, it's essentially a hero story. I mean, it has political connotations and it's grounded in the events of the real world, let's say. But fundamentally, it's, one lone guy supported by his dutiful wife who's motivated by higher order principles to take on the worst of the predators and the parasites. Okay, and so, yes, people are dying for that. People have always died for that story, like psychologically and literally, because it's the right story. The hero stands up against the tyrant.
Yep. Nice.
Right? The hero leads people out of slavery. The hero confronts the dragon. There's no getting away from that. That's the intrinsic pattern of our...
The hero fights against the womanist, wokest garbage that has infiltrated our society and is not only false, but stupid.
Instinctual being. And the reason we find those stories meaningful is because meaning is the instinct that guides us on that revelatory and redemptive pathway. And you see, this is where the atheist types get it so wrong, because they tend, like the more literal Protestants, to assume that what religious practice is the mouthing of a set of propositions, right? It's like a theory of the world. And that's not the case. It's a manner of conducting yourself, directing your attention and acting. And then there's representations of that in imagination and semantically, but the fundamental issue is the actual pattern of action. That's why the highest level of religious devotion in the Christian tradition, it's the same in Buddhism with regard to Buddha. It's the imitation of Christ. It's the attempt to act out the archetype in the confines of your life. And the offering there is that, this is a strange offering. The offering there is that that's possible. It's possible for each person to operate as a center of divinity in the world. And I don't believe that there is a more reliable truth than that. And I also think that's true scientifically, by the way.
Yes, it's beautiful that the word conduct obviously has those connotations of being a carriage for energy or for heat that you can connect to the source through conduct. Regarding atheism, tell us a little of your recent challenge. We did a video on it to Richard Dawkins, who we've had on the show. I've had conversations with. Do you think that he's an example of the reductive atheism and deliberate straw man atheism?
Oh, yes and no. You know, the thing about Dawkins is I like Dawkins, and he's super smart, and I learned a lot from reading his books. And I think that Dawkins fundamentally is an intellectually honest man. I don't think he knows how to reconcile the gap between the propositional view of religion and the scientific view. Now, I think he's wrong on a variety of fronts.
Sorry, I admit that I don't understand the difference between the propositional and relational, or whatever it is that he just said. Please let me know in the comments if you can explain it, because this is above my pay grade.
Think that his reading of the biblical corpus is particularly sophisticated. It's dismissive. Now, what Dawkins does is the same thing that Harris does, is that they're very opposed to the totalitarian proclivity, and rightly so. But they identify the totalitarian proclivity with the religious enterprise. Now, there are totalitarian proclivities within the religious enterprise, right? Because the most psychopathic tyrants will use the highest principles to justify their own self-interest. So the worst totalitarians are likely the ones who subvert religion. And that's rightfully objected to, but you can't throw the baby out with the bathwater. And Dawkins and Harris both underestimate the necessity of narrative, the irreducible necessity of narrative, and they don't contend with the fact of religious phenomenology, right? The religious experience as such, the instinct of meaning. Now, Harris has moved in that direction because he is a devoted meditator. And so he admits in practice that there is a religious enterprise. He doesn't like to concretize it, but partly that's because Sam knows perfectly well at some level that if he concretized his relationship with the divine, his rational mind would tear it to shreds and leave him bereft. So I have been in contact with Dawkins representatives since you made that video, and since Dr. Dawkins and I have been bandying back and forth on Twitter, and there is some possibility that we will meet and discuss these things. And I would like it to be a discussion, because this is not simple. And I don't think it's not the place where you want to have a defeat. I understand where Dawkins is coming from, but I think that, see, he's such an interesting person because his notion of mean is right on the threshold of the notion of archetype. If he would have pursued that, he would have entered the Jungian world, because the ultimate memes are sacred stories. Now, then the question is, does the meme bear any relationship to reality? And the answer is, well, it depends on what you mean by reality. And I know that sounds like a cop-out, but it isn't, because memes that survive, you can make a perfectly reasonable argument that the memes that survive over the longest spans of times are the ones that most effectively serve the purposes of reproduction. And that's a Darwinian argument, which Dawkins should support. And I would say that the memes that have guided us, let's say the memes that are part of the biblical tradition that have lasted for at least thousands and likely tens of thousands of years, are the memes that have been selected by two processes of reproduction, right? The transmission of information, so the propagation of information as reproduction, but that have also facilitated genuine reproduction itself. And so I don't understand.
Right.
I don't see how someone who's Darwinian in their thinking can avoid that conclusion if they take their thinking right to the logical end. Successful memes.
So what he's saying is successful ideas directly help with reproduction, and religion is one such idea. But that seems intuitively obvious to me. If everything is Darwinian, then of course that's the way that things work. I don't understand why that's a hard thing to agree with. That seems like quite an easy thing to agree with. Just because an idea is useful for evolution, useful for reproduction, helps with the success of societies, doesn't necessarily mean that it's true. It just means that it's useful, right? So even if you aren't a religious person, or even if you're an atheist,
have emerged as a consequence of Darwinian competition. And so why would you not say, then they're adapted to the world, then they're microcosms of the world? Dawkins himself said that an adapted organism, he said this explicitly in a brilliant paper, an adapted organism must be a microcosm of the world. Well, we're storied organisms. So how in the world can you not derive the conclusion that what we live in is best construed as a story?
Very cool, because we're made of star stuff. So it's very cool to say that we are also a microcosm of the environment, in addition to being part of the macrocosm as well. We're very intimately connected.
I think it is. I think it's inevitable. And then the question is, well, what's the story? Well, we've been trying to figure that out since we've been able to communicate. Thousands, tens of thousands of years. And voluntary self-sacrifice, the dragon fight motif, the bearing of the cross, the voluntary bearing of the cross, that being the precondition for redemption and renewal. That's all part of that system of ideas. And I think it's inescapable.
Yes, that there would have to be some concomitant magnetism. There would, for a meme to land, for a meme to imprint. It can't sustain its own ongoing randomness and simultaneously narrativize. Those two things are there's a juxtaposition in that.
Another way of looking at it, you're absolutely right. Here's another way of looking at it. The stories that survive are those that are maximally adapted to the structure of human memory and communication. Obviously, because they wouldn't be remembered or transmitted. They wouldn't strike home. They wouldn't have any compelling power. So the stories have to arrange themselves so they're analogs of the biological substrate that's representing them. And
that's actually also a very interesting idea, that ideas arrange themselves to best fit the thing that they're coming from. Actually, what that means is that this could also be affected by convergent evolution, right? So, meaning different animals are going to have different communications that axe themselves on different thinking patterns. Very, very cool insights here. All right. I think that's a pretty good place to end the video. Hit the like, hit the sub, hit all the notifications. Drop me a donation like Hunter M, Adrian R, Tom and Bobby, Dylan, Renaissance Press, Brian, Andrew, and Alan. Shout outs to you, most recent purchaser of Strategist Guide to Seduction. Thank you. Again, buy my books at bit.ly/heliosbooks. Again, thank you to everyone who's already bought. It's fantastic. I really do appreciate it. Want me to help you out? Well, I do offer coaching. Just message me at theheliosblog@gmail.com. That's my email, and I'll slot you right in. And my Patreon can be accessed at patreon.com/theheliosblog. That contains early access to my videos. So if you don't like watching my videos one per day, if you want to watch every one that I'm going to make for the whole week or whatever, for the next 4 days, all in one day, that's going to be available on my Patreon. All right. And I think I'll just post it on the days that I tend to make my videos, Tuesday and Saturday. So, you'll get 4 videos ahead or 3 videos ahead, whatever. Depends on the day. Okay. Thank you so much for watching, guys. I really do appreciate it, especially if you watch to the end. Take care of yourselves, and I'll see you next time.